Are there changes in the agenda at all that we need to announce, Sarah or Nadia?
No.
I'm going to look at them. No? Okay. Great. Go for it, Sarah.
Yeah, we are recording, so I'll just say this is the meeting of the Just Transition Subcommittee for the Vermont Climate Council on April 8th.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone to our meeting this week. The first thing that we'd like to do per the usual is offer introductions from everyone. What we'd like today is for everyone to say their name and the best piece of advice they've ever received. So say that again, your name and the best piece of advice you've ever received. I'll give everyone about 30 seconds to kind of think about it before they go. I'll go first to give folks more time, and just as a heads up, after me, I'm going to call on Iris. So 30 seconds starts now. The best piece of advice you've ever received. All righty, we're going to count down slowly. Okay. So again, I'm going to go first. My name is Nadia Pabst, and the best piece of advice I've ever received, and I thought about this in my 30 seconds, is I've been very fortunate to have a number of mentors in my life, but the most standout mentor for me is my grandfather, hands down. And one thing that he told me time and again, and it is a sort of a rally cry, if you will, in the Mexican American or Mexican community, is dale duro, or dale ganas, which means give it all you got. And so any opportunity I've had to really muster courage or really be an advocate for change, those are the words that really come to mind, and definitely the best piece of advice I've ever received. So with that, Iris, you're up. And if you could just popcorn to the next person, that'd be awesome.
That's a really tough starter. Hi, I'm Iris Chung. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a youth member on this subcommittee. And I would say that just like my dad always tells me that I can't do everything. That I should give it all I've got, but that I can't do everything. And that's something that's just really important. So I guess I'll pass it on to Sarah then.
Yeah, I think you passed it to me, Iris. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So Sarah Phillips, she, her pronouns, Office of Economic Opportunity at Department for Children and Families. And gosh, I feel like I've gotten a lot of good advice. I was thinking about one recently. I was in the Peace Corps in West Africa for 2 years and in Guinea. And one of the sort of local sayings that I think is a good piece of advice is that little by little, the bird builds its nest, which I think is just really very, very true. It has a lot of deep truth for me in that. So, and it's good for me because I'm always wanting to build a nest really quickly. So, and I think I will tag in Chris.
Chris Campany. I remember always my dad told me that you're now an adult, and that means that you can do whatever you want, but you alone are responsible for everything that you do. I will turn it over to Amanda.
Hey there, my name is Amanda. I work at Capstone Community Action and I'm staffing this committee. The best piece of advice I received was from my mother, and that was to always be kind and empathetic because you don't know what someone's background is that they're bringing to the situation. And I'll pass it off to Danielle.
Danielle Bombardier, and let's see, something they say out in the field a lot, I work as an electrician, is work smarter, not harder. I always find that helpful. And I will pass to Liz.
Hi everyone, my name is Liz Shields, I'm a staff person from the Department of Environmental Conservation. I serve with EcoAmeriCorps through them. And one of the best pieces of advice I have ever gotten, and I say this to myself every morning, is choose your attitude. That really sets me up for my day. So, oh, and I will pop it to Kaya.
Hello all, Kaya Morris. I use she, her pronouns. Climate Council Subcommittee Chair for Just Transitions Committee. A piece of advice that I received that changed my life in so many ways I didn't expect was don't give yourself a no before you've gotten a yes. So it's to not give up on a process or not pursue an opportunity without even finding out whether or not you would get it. So it's been great advice. I'm trying to see who we still have. Virginia, have you gone? Oh, wait, you don't even have a microphone.
Yes.
Okay.
I think I'm guessing the question. So Virginie Diambo, I am a CVO staff, and I try to always be optimistic. Optimism, yeah. Thank you.
Wonderful. And if you can call on the next person, we still have David, Jennifer, Ross, Abby, and I believe that's it.
So David.
Oh, and Susan, of course.
Hey everybody, my name is David Plum. I am helping facilitate different pieces of the Vermont Climate Council and providing support to this subcommittee and others. One of the best pieces of advice I've gotten in my work as a mediator is if there's something that's really difficult, just name it, lean into it and name it. Don't run away from it. It's right there. Put it out there on the table. So folks from the subcommittee is still here. Who hasn't gone? Beverly. Sorry, I apologize. Kelly, there you are. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Kelly Klein. I am a member of the Climate Council as a representative of the small business community. I'm the owner and CEO of Grenfell Meadery and Havoc Mead. And in addition to this committee, I am also on the cross-sector mitigation committee. And I'm so glad you spoke about your grandfather, Nadia, because that clued me in. My grandfather, the best advice I got from him was moderation in all things, including moderation. So let's see. Sue, you haven't gone yet, right?
No, I have not. And I love this question. And I think I've gotten a lot of great advice, but the first thing that popped into my mind is my father-in-law had always said, and it's on his stone, to thine own self be true. I try to do that. Did we heard from, who else have we heard from? Kelly? Jane, how about Jane?
Hi, everybody. This is really making me recognize that all my great mentors in my life, I had never had anybody give me like this one critical piece of advice that has stuck with me. But I will say that as I transitioned into this job, I left my supervisor who was with me and was my boss for 16 years, essentially like from 28 to 45 almost. And he is beyond important to me. And as I sort of like had to launch from him, he told me not to look back. And it's not actually advice that I use all the time because I think we learn so much about who we are and what we do from looking back and reflecting. But I'm trying really hard, and that was more in my remorse and trying not to be sad about leaving him and moving on to a new job. So that's what I have for now to offer. But let me think about other staff. Ross, I'll popcorn to you.
Sure. Thank you, Jane. There's a few to consider, but I think of words to live by that was shared to me by Chuck Gallagher. He was an Act 250 coordinator for several years, public transit program manager and a principal planner that we hired when I was in New Jersey, and dealing with a lot of different characters and programs and problems. He several times would say, well, seems like they're flawed like the rest of us. And my kids hear it all the time when we complain about other folks doing other things. We just try to accept everybody understanding that we too have our own flaws, and that's been nice to be living with. And I think Abby, if she hasn't gone yet.
I haven't. Thanks, Ross. I'm Abby Willard. I'm a staff support to the subcommittee from the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. And the advice that I was thinking about was when I was going to college, my dad joined me for like the orientation meeting, and he had been a state stewardship forester for his career. And he said, just remember that managing natural resources is about 90% managing people and about 10% managing the resource. And I didn't fully believe him at the time, but boy, he was correct. So in the end, it was wonderful advice. And I will pass it to Jen. Jennifer, have you gone?
Hi there, I'm Jennifer Micah, General Counsel for DCF. And I guess I'll take a practical approach to this question. As a lawyer, the biggest complaint lawyers get is that they don't pick up the phone when their clients call. And I have to admit, I was one of those lawyers who didn't pick up the phone until one day I decided I just needed to pick up the phone. And it was absolutely transformative, and it helps you put aside all your fears and concerns and just gets you right into the game. So I would say that take advice from your clients.
Thank you. Is there anyone else we're missing who hasn't gone? All right, thanks for those really awesome stories, everyone. It's just great to see the ways in which our communities build us and how we have these important influencers to really build the personalities that bring us to the table and to the leadership opportunity we have before us to address just transition. So pat on the back to all those people who gave you some fantastic advice. The next thing that we have on the agenda is the review and approval of agenda and the minutes. So last week's minutes were sent around by Sarah. Did anyone have any issues with those or feedback that they'd like to provide before the committee or subcommittee? Great. So if you can give a thumbs up if you are in favor of them, or raise your hand if you are opposed to them, let me know. All righty. So those are approved. The next thing we have to go through is our agenda. So today we're meeting from 4 to 6 p.m. We have our welcome and check-in, which we've already done. We are reviewing our agenda and minutes now. We'll then go to sharing our personal stories. So our subcommittee spotlight with Danielle, which we're all very excited to hear her perspectives on. We'll then go to a community listen, followed by public comment. The next subject will be public engagement, led by David. Then we'll have public comment again. And then finally, we'll have reflections, and we will adjourn thereafter. Does anyone have any feedback or comments on the proposed agenda? Everyone thumbs up? Oh, pardon me. Go ahead, Sue.
Nadja, I just want to explain that that we had anticipated meeting directly with the consultants undertaking the public engagement process, but unfortunately that's not possible today. So we're really lucky to be able to begin our conversation on that with facilitating help from David, but we didn't feel that we could delay that conversation. So it's a big part of what we want to talk about today. So I just want to mention that. And I don't know if we've described what we mean by community listening, but we can do that before we begin. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And so with that, the agenda is approved. Great. Thank you. Next thing that we have are additional announcements and subcommittee business. So some housekeeping. I believe, and Jane, correct me if I'm wrong, it is required of subcommittee members to have your videos on during these meetings. So if you can, please have them recording. Please have your face visible. It's a great thing. We are all public servants, and people like to see your smiling faces. As per our last meeting, we have, as you've seen in the agenda, added sections to provide for public comment throughout our hearing rather than having it at the end. And thank you for, I believe it was Iris who pointed that out as a fantastic opportunity to ensure that members of the public as well as members of the subcommittee have an opportunity to provide comment in a space to feel comfortable doing so. And I wanted to raise too, the last time we had a meeting, Jane, there were some questions around per diem. Do you want to touch on that lightly? Essentially, what is it and how do you proceed in securing your per diem?
Oh, yeah, happy to. Sorry, I must have missed that at the last meeting. Maybe it was at the end, but yeah, all subcommittee members, like counselors, are entitled to per diems. They're $50 for every meeting that you attend, whether they're half an hour or I should say subcommittee meeting, whether they're a half an hour or 2 hours. And so there is an email. I hope that you, as I think I resent it to when all the subcommittee members were on board, but if anybody doesn't have it, I'm happy to resend it. That has the paperwork that you need to fill out, and Donna Vians, who works in our business office, you have to set up an account with her. And then it's a fairly simple process with a form that you just send in me at your discretion of how often and how many intervals you want to do. And I know that some members here on the committee have been taking advantage of that. And I really encourage all of you to, because we budgeted for all subcommittee members to get per diems for what we saw as the expected number of meetings to occur. So if there's any questions, follow up with me in an email, but otherwise, if it's helpful, I'd be actually, why don't I just say I will do this? I will resend to the Just Transitions Committee the information I've sent on per diems before.
Great, thank you. And the last thing I'd like to touch on is yesterday we had a great EJ workshop. Thank you for those on the subcommittee who were able to attend. And Sue or Sarah, since you guys put that together, do you guys want to add in a bit of a summary of what happened and some important points for our members?
Well, since Sarah's not here, I would just say that the effort that we want to encourage you all to watch it because it was recorded, and it was, I think, an excellent presentation from a legal scholar and at UVM, the Rubenstein School of Environmental Management, where we were looking at Vermont-specific environmental justice challenges or environmental injustices that we have, an analysis and a spatial analysis mapping experience. But I don't want to go into more detail than that. I would say we learned about key elements of what justice means, and we learned the importance of public engagement. And I think for those who were there, we'll have time later in the agenda to reflect. But it was great. We had lots of participation. I think there were 69 or so people at one point. I've heard positive feedback. I think there's a lot of great learning and learning ahead. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And so with that, we will shift now to updates from Director Lazarchak.
Thanks, everybody. I don't think I have a ton of updates relevant to this committee this week, but what I will let you know that we've been working really hard to get the RFP out the door for the technical analysis needed with respect to the climate action plan. It's been like an all hands on deck sort of effort with a lot of cooks in the kitchen from the subcommittees. So we've had excellent input really on this one from the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee, and the Science and Data Subcommittee. And so we are closing the door on input tomorrow. And I think we're in a really good place to work to finalize the little bit that's left to go to put the RFP either out tomorrow afternoon or by Monday at the latest. So that's sort of been a real heavy lift over the last few weeks, getting us to a point of place with respect to clarity on the bulk of technical analysis we needed, really pertaining to the greenhouse gas reduction requirements of the law. And I'll just remind everybody that there'll be an opportunity still for other subcommittees to consider what other technical services perhaps might be needed via a contractor grant in the coming weeks. And that certainly pertains to all of you as you learn more about other contracts that are have work related to your scope of work with respect to things like the mapping tool that may or may not be sufficient for all of you, we're happy to consider and rank up other needs, and we'll certainly have funding left over after this first round to make some of those things happen. And so I will think thoughtfully as we get this RFP out about a process to bring forward to the subcommittees in the coming weeks to review and rank other analyses needed for the plan this time around. And then I'll also speak to David is helping me facilitate and push forward a draft for the climate action plan so that we can help facilitate the steering committee to approve a table of contents that will then be brought to the full council for the bulk of the April meeting to consider how we put forward the climate action plan in December. And hopefully that outline and table of contents will allow us to build backwards from that, also to provide the subcommittees templates and formats to feed your work into that climate action plan in the coming weeks and months also. So that's where we're at with respect to the work with the steering committee and the council for the April meeting. And I'm really hopeful that that will help and bring clarity to sort of what we're all working towards and striving for the December 1st plan. And then finally, I'll just say that I am really sorry that the contract wasn't able to be in place. I really, I know I giving Sue a little heartburn that maybe something might fall apart, but we are so close with the contract. And one of the issues was that they weren't, by the time we sort of got through the negotiations, they weren't able to join this time slot, even as much as I pushed them, but we won't hold that against them. And they have it on their calendar for next week. And our director of communications for the agency and I are meeting with them tomorrow. And they did really want to sort of have an introductory meeting before they came and spoke with all of you. And I'm really hopeful that the conversation that you'll all have with David today will position you well to ask thoughtful and help me tee up them to be able to respond to all of you and work with you collaboratively going forward on what outreach and engagement will look like in the coming months. So thanks for your patience for that and look forward to it next week.
Great. Any questions, anyone? Fantastic. Thank you. So the next item that we have is our personal spotlight, if you will, with Danielle. Thank you so much for agreeing to engage in today's subcommittee on this important issue. And again, as a reminder to everyone, the reason why we're doing this is because we are significantly challenged by remote meetings. And we want to make sure that as we progress and we build a team to work on the important issues before us, we know who we are, what we bring to the table, and really the kinds of collaboration that we need to focus on as we move forward. So with that, Danielle, thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry I'm driving and if the noise is in the background, I apologize about that. I'm on the way to a monthly union meeting, so can't miss it. I did send a slide along. I didn't know if it's possible to share it.
Yeah, I'll do that.
I can't tell if it's being.
Go ahead and get started. My computer's a little slow here.
Okay. So I'll just start with my professional experience. Most recently, I was an organizer and a membership development director for IBEW Local 300. So my job was to bring more contractors and members into the Electrical Workers Union. I've done that for the past 3 years. I also was the training director for the union as well. So working with contractors and communities to get apprentices properly registered with the state and setting up their classes, and that was for about 40 apprentices across all of our contractors. In 2019, I was elected Secretary Treasurer of the Vermont AFL-CIO, so I've been on the executive committee for 2 years, and I've been a member of the Vermont Building and Construction Trades Council since 2018. Before that, I spent 5 years working for Sherwin Electric Company as an apprentice electrician and then a licensed electrician for 2 years. And before that, I worked for another company, Peck Electric. And Before I got into the trades, I served as an AmeriCorps member for 2 years. I worked with COTS, the Committee on Temporary Shelter, and I worked specifically in homelessness prevention, and that was in Burlington. Personal background, I grew up in Vermont. I grew up in Colchester. I graduated Colchester High School in 2004. I threw a couple pictures up here. I live in Colchester now. I have an 8-year-old daughter. After high school, I went to college because that's what you did. I got a degree in molecular genetics, which I never ended up using. I actually got really nervous at the end of college and ran off to Europe and was a nanny for a year, then traveled a little bit and returned home. And one thing that I'm really proud of and that I'm still quite involved in was a program that I went through with Vermont Works for Women, which actually got me into the trades. It was called Step Up to Electrical. And I always try and give back to Vermont Works for Women because without that program, I really wouldn't be where I am today. And I'm very grateful for that. They still have a program running to help women get into the trades, and the trades need more women. And then in terms of, what I feel like I can bring to this subcommittee, as a labor representative, I will be focusing on ensuring that working Vermonters are positively impacted by programs and policies. I believe that as a construction worker and a member of the building trades, I have a unique labor perspective in the private sector. And while I know there are great employers out there, I also know that we need to do all that we can to improve the lives of those working for private contractors, especially ensuring family sustaining pay and benefits and safe working conditions. Setting baseline pay requirements is something that I'm particularly focused on, such as prevailing wage standards. And one thing I'm proud of the work the building trades did in 2019 is we passed a responsible contractor ordinance in Montpelier to set prevailing wage standards, and then just this year introduced a similar ordinance in Burlington. And then also as an executive committee member of the Vermont State Labor Federation, AFL-CIO, I have a responsibility to represent 10,000 working Vermonters, many in the public sector. So while that's not my strong point and not my experience, I will focus just as hard on public sector as I do on private sector. And as a member of the subcommittee, I'm here to bring their voices to the table. So that's all I have. And if anyone has any follow-up questions or comments, I'm happy to take them.
Great. And Danielle, just to read some of the comments we have in the chat, Liz says, yay for AmeriCorps. And Jane says that she started her career there. So you're in fantastic company.
Yeah, AmeriCorps was quite an experience for sure.
And so thank you, Danielle, for that fantastic presentation. We're grateful for your leadership in the labor union, and particularly on this committee with its roots so deeply embedded in the labor movement. Having your representation here is both critical and something that we are incredibly appreciative of, and we're really excited for the insights to come. My question, and then we'll dive into anyone else who'd like to raise some, is you talk about women in the labor movement, and I can't imagine the challenges that you face, but also the great advances that you've seen in your experience there. So what does it feel like? What is your best achievement, if you will, in being a woman in a male-dominant space?
Ooh. My greatest achievement, I think just sticking it out and actually going back to it is my greatest achievement, that it's possible for us to be successful. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I have a quick question.
Thank you.
Oh, wait. Danielle, do you see more women getting involved in the trades? And are there feeders coming from high school career tech centers feeding people into the trades?
Yeah, so part of what I did as apprenticeship director was kind of build those networks through the tech centers, through different community organizations. And there is a lot of focus on getting more women into the trades. but what we lack is retaining them. So yes, to begin with, we do see more women on the job, but we don't see them staying.
How big is the IBEW in Vermont?
We represent about 900 members across the state. However, that includes all of the line, not all, most of the utility line workers, some municipalities, a police department, the hospital and tree trimmers, and then a handful, about 150 electricians that work for private contractors.
Chris, I see your hand raised.
Did you engage much with the or maybe the same union, with the Vermont Yankee unionized workers?
So yeah, it is IBEW workers well, some of them at Vermont Yankee, and that was happening right as I was coming in. So I didn't, I missed a lot of that. I missed a lot of the shutdown, but I do know the impact it had on our union, and it was very significant. And most of those working members actually left Vermont after it shut down.
Amanda, I see your hand raised. Is it just up from before?
No, I have another question. Thank you. Something just came to mind. Is your industry, specifically the electrical industry, are you guys gearing up or doing any greater workforce development programs with the mass electrification of our society that's coming?
The IBEW International Office has a lot of different programs in place, and I think that we will be. Actually, 30% of the solar that has been installed in Vermont has been done with IBEW labor. So we are sort of in that realm, on the renewable side of things. We do have different trainings trying to keep up with technology, like electric vehicle infrastructure training program. But my focus when I worked for the IBEW was on construction unit only. So commercial and industrial electricians, I wasn't really engaged with the utility side of things. But I do, those conversations are definitely happening, not only in Vermont, but regionally.
Thank you.
Great, and Danielle, since you're in the car, we'll just flag some items that are coming up in the chat. Sarah has said that she wants to talk to you about some strategies to get more women into weatherization. And we can send you.
Absolutely.
Sarah, would you like to add any color there?
Yeah, no, just that I'm thinking about that part of my job, right, which is, and Sue and others, is, the low-income weatherization program is a whole course of construction workers doing good work, and we need more women in that field, especially as we're going to be growing it, and I'll have to pick your brain on that. We're also have been doing a lot of thinking around wages in the weatherization field, and national survey that's not around that. I'd love to pick your brain around some ideas around how we in the field.
And Chris, go ahead, sorry. Chris also raised a question. Do you want to present it to Danielle?
Sure. I was just, when we moved into another house during the pandemic, one of the first things we got rid of a lot of gas appliances, went to electric. And one of the things that just occurred to me was, should we be planning on most every home in Vermont needing 200 amp service? Because to me, that's going to get, if that's the case, that represents a just transitions issue, because that's not an inexpensive service to have done.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So when you start talking about heat, you're going to need some more power. Absolutely.
And you add to it the car, the hot water heater, the dryer, the washing machine, everything.
Any last questions while Danielle's on her beautiful drive? Great, thank you so much. Chris, just a heads up that you are the next person, alphabetically by last name, up to provide a presentation. We'll shoot you an email to ask some questions to make sure you are willing to participate and if what you need to move forward, but we're excited to hear your background, particularly when it comes to Vermont Yankee and the decommissioning of it. I think that's huge for informing our process here. You seem excited already. And with that, the next item on our agenda is a community listen with Beverly Little Thunder. Kaya, or pardon me, I'll back up a little bit. We were discussing the importance of creating a space for not only the stories that we bring to the table, but the sectors in which we represent. And we cannot emphasize enough how important it is to create these safe spaces to talk about marginalized voices and impacted voices as we move through, once again, this complex issue of just transitions. And so, Kaya, I'd like to welcome you to discuss this more in depth on why this is important and why we're doing this on the subcommittee. And with that, Kaya.
Good evening, everyone. So thank you so much for this space. So this is important, I think, as we are centralizing the work. Those who were able to participate in last night's call saw and felt very clearly the need to center the voices of those who are not in the room. How do we contextualize when we think about what is our vision for just transition? What does climate justice actually mean? What is environmental justice? Is equity actually something that we can tangibly say this is where we will be? And so this gives us an opportunity to hear directly from folks that are from these impacted communities to speak about this. This is what's happening at our Heart Center. These are the conversations we're happening, and these are our hopes and dreams. And we needed to carve out a dedicated space to ensure that that conversation can happen without interruption. And in the fullness of us honoring and respecting our charge to do this really deep and active listening in order to make this work meaningful. So I'm really, really grateful for this space. I think it is unique for state government to do this, and I'm proud that we're giving this precedent for us to move forward with and supporting others in this work. So today we have been graciously offered the opportunity to hear from one of our own subcommittee members, Beverly Little Thunder, who is an amazing activist and elder, someone I consider dear family, who has been on the front lines of this work since the day she was born. And as an individual who serves as well as a commissioner on the Native American Commission, has been bringing her subject matter expertise and bringing their the voices of the communities that are represented through the commission into this work. Thank you so much, Beverly, for making the time to be with us today.
With that, Beverly, are you on the line? Beverly, are you on the line? We seem to be having some technical difficulties.
Absolutely.
So why don't we jump to our next agenda item, and then I'll reach out to Beverly during that part. And with that, we'll go to, does anyone have any questions on this specific issue, or pardon me, the space that we're going to carve out as a community listen moving forward? Great. All right. So David, would you like to go on to the public engagement process, please?
Sure. And I think before we do that, we had talked about the pieces of our agenda, and I think we'll do one before we go in public engagement piece. And so I'm happy to lead that off and facilitate that too. We got some feedback that it's helpful not to just do public comment at the end of the meeting, but after key sections. We haven't really gotten too deep into anything except ourselves so far, but why don't we just take a moment, if folks are joining us today that aren't subcommittee members and want to say something now before we go into our next piece around public engagement, now's a perfectly good time. Feel free to raise your hand or just unmute yourself to say anything right now. Okay. Great. So I'm not hearing folks now, and that's fine. Stick around, and we're going to do another round after we have our conversation on public engagement. I think that'll be a good opportunity to get other voices in if folks are listening in and joining us today. So we'll circle back at the end. Okay, great. So let's talk about public engagement. As you'll remember from our discussion last week and the week before, you as a Just Transition Subcommittee have two very important streams of work, or two big ideas that you're working on, right? And they connect, they intersect. One of the big ideas you're working on is how you develop what we're calling draft guiding principles for a just and equitable transition, right? And how those draft guiding principles become some sort of an assessment tool that's helpful for the other subcommittees, right? So that's a stream of work to getting those draft guiding principles, evolving that into an assessment tool, and that's in service of the other subcommittees. And you're going to help the other subcommittees implement those principles and then do some assessment with the tool. The other stream of work, the second stream of work, is really around how to engage the public and how to engage people in this process of developing a climate action plan for Vermont. Okay, so that's one of your two big pieces of work that you've been asked to do as a Just Transitions Subcommittee. We wanted to open up today the possibility of starting to say, what should that really look like? And I'll frame this up by saying a lot of folks are looking to you as a subcommittee to come up with some core ideas around what engagement looks like through a justice and equity lens. The other subcommittees are looking for your ideas on this, and this is a place where you can have a lot of as a subcommittee. And so this is an interesting opportunity to really start to say, what do we want to do here? What is it we want to recommend in terms of engaging diverse publics with the justice and equity lens in this climate work? As Jane's mentioned several times, there's a consultant coming on board right now as we speak that can do the heavy lifting and actually doing some of that work and implementing. You folks can be really central in guiding it. The first question I had to sort of throw out on the table right now was about those of you who listened in last night, and there was discussion about engagement. What did you take away from that? That is sort of some seeds of what you want to start talking about in terms of what just and equitable engagement looks like on climate. So for those of you that were listening in last night, what, in terms of how you engage people and how this process should engage people, what are some of the big ideas that you think came out of last night? And I'm going to do something a little different with this question. And I'm interested to start with folks here on the subcommittee who aren't members of the Climate Council, right? Let's start with the folks who aren't Climate Council members and see, I assume there's some overlap there of folks who were on the call last night. But if you're not a Climate Council member and you were listening last night, what did you take away from this in terms of how to engage folks in this process? Any initial thoughts? Feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand.
So David, this is Abby Willard, support staff. I was able to listen last night. Some of the suggestions around sort of public participation are things that government's typically not very good at, unfortunately, which is taking time for the process, making it incredibly accessible, which looks like offering childcare, potentially paying for food,
yep,
paying people for their contribution, acknowledging their knowledge and their time, and addressing access issues, whether it's virtual and technology and broadband related, or in person, which requires, timing and location and maybe even a technological alternative if it's an in-person meeting. So those are some of the kind of things that came to mind for me from last night.
Thanks. That's great. Others want to build on that?
One of the big takeaways I heard was engaging people who aren't usually part of the conversation very early in the process.
I.e. now.
Yeah, which makes me think that we need to be talking about that at this meeting today. Like, let's get started on this right away.
I think one of the things that I've been sort of meditating on around this is what it means to start with listening in public engagement, and that rang true for me last night too. That the listening part of this is really important as a starting place. So what that means in terms of methods and strategies and timing and all of that. And then I think to add to that, there's maybe this isn't fully formed, but I think, as Bindu last night was talking, the ability to go door to door or just to meet people where they are instead of asking them to come to you is sort of really powerful and is just more effective, frankly. And so what would it look like to do public engagement in a way that went to where people were as opposed to inviting them to us? That feels important to me. And it also answers Kai's questions, which is what I want to see as part of an engagement process.
Great. Great. So big ideas emerging here about taking the time that's needed for a process like this, about making it accessible and meeting people where they are, about engaging early, particularly with people who are not typically part of the conversation, and figure out methods for listening that really work in a situation like this. So those are 4 big ideas that have been named and some good, important detail in them. People who have done, go ahead.
I think I would love to, I think it would be really important to be able to also consider opportunities for creating affinity spaces for people to speak kind of to their unique experiences. I think what we saw from Rejoice was very positive and important for people to be able to feel like it's a peer-led conversation and it's not necessarily somebody with a badge, or some kind of demarcation of a difference, an authority figure, so to speak, that they're speaking to. They're talking to the state, that this is a conversation amongst a community. I would also want to see a community engagement process that almost begins with curiosity and a willingness to educate, but not from a paternalistic standpoint, like you don't understand climate goals, but more like how this work actually fits in tangibly into the lived experiences that people are having, so I thought it was important, those connections that like Senator Rahm spoke about, thinking about what that flood resilience means for folks living in mobile home parks. They would not think, oh my gosh, we need to address our climate crisis because it might affect my mobile home, but once they feel those impacts, they understand it and can see how something needs to be done much more effectively. Obviously, we are going to need to, provide those different pieces, like we talked about, the additional services and potential compensation. So understanding that will happen and be necessary. And then we have to have accessibility. Accessibility has to be really, really key. So not just the language translation, but also with interpretation for sign, whatever people might need in the ways that they can participate and do so meaningfully.
Yeah.
I also want to add to what Kaya is saying, interpretation, translation services, if you can provide those, if you can have access to those. I'm also thinking about raising civic engagement in the people who don't necessarily have any knowledge on what energy is, because a lot of the refugees specifically that resettled here in Vermont lived in refugee camps for many years. Some of them were born in refugee camps, so they have never seen winter, they have never seen heater, things like that. They have no idea of what weatherization is. So how, and those people, there are some of them that may have very significant things to say. They can, add to the conversation. So I'm wondering how we can bring those voice in this conversation.
Yeah. And I think, Virginia, I would be very interested to hear your view about how to bring those voices into the conversation. Having, with your experience about what works or what doesn't work, Virginia, do you have some immediate thoughts about how to orient this?
Yeah, I'm thinking about, focus groups, organizing focus groups when we get rid of COVID, because a lot of the people that I'm thinking about are not technology savvy. So it's going to be difficult for them to attend meetings through Zoom or through Teams. So organizing focus group is a good way to really invite people into this conversation and to make them feel that they belong, because that's the notion of belonging is really important, and we have to emphasize on that. And getting them, in the conversation will be a good way to have them participate in the life of the community.
Yeah. Other thoughts that build on this?
The other thing also is for us to to participate in the events that those people organize. It's great to kind of, go to them and show them that, okay, we want to participate in your life as well. So I think it goes both ways, focus group, but also us going to them and, being really participating in the initiative that they're organizing.
That's great. Iris, I think you were trying to say something, but we're on mute.
Sorry. I just want to reiterate the compensation aspect, because I think that focus groups and affinity groups are really important. But I think I heard at the last meeting of this subcommittee that we have the ability to compensate people for sharing their experience, and I think it's really important that we utilize that. I would also mention that I think that when we're hearing these voices, we should give kind of a broad subject, because I think sometimes we are going in and saying, we want your feedback on this aspect of the climate action plan, or this specific thing. And regardless of whether the things are actually outside of that, people often perceive that they're outside of that. And we need to be hearing all the issues that people are facing, because that's the way that we begin to engage them at the beginning of the process, because then we can work to solve those issues with them and work on what is actually mattering to them versus what we tell them we want their feedback on, and then what they think matters to them within that specific context. And then as far as youth voice goes, I think that it's just especially BIPOC voice, it's important to again compensate folks and just make sure that we're publicizing this, and frankly, I'm really grateful that we've integrated this better, in my opinion, public comment thing in this meeting, because I think it creates a feeling that we actually are interested in hearing what people have to say. We're not just checking a box. And I think that should be something that should be more widely implemented across the subcommittees, because I think that if people have things to say, we need to be kind of asking for that input, because otherwise people don't feel comfortable just butting in and telling us what they need and want. Yeah.
Thanks, Iris. Yeah. Chris?
One of the things that struck me, just looking ahead, if you think about everything that was discussed last night around what environmental justice and climate justice are, and how you engage people to where you can achieve those rights of, access to the outdoors, air, water, air rights, water rights, food rights, everything that was laid out. Look at how remarkably well-resourced the Climate Council is and the work that we're doing now. But then if you think about it, this is the very beginning of a process. A lot of work gets done, and I was pointed to the council to wear a municipal perspective hat. If you look at how diffuse land use planning and just planning in general is in the state, I'm looking ahead to how all this gets implemented at the local planning commission level, local select board level, and at the regional planning commission level, that too, because that's where a lot of the key decisions get made, including about whether or not to even participate in a lot of the policy decisions that get laid out by the legislature and the state. Whether or not the state tends to take a carrot and stick approach, primarily carrots. Towns choose to plan. They don't have to plan. Towns choose to have bylaws. They don't have to have bylaws. They can choose to have a plan reviewed and approved. And, a lot of big issues, the state tends to say, here's this really big stuff we need to do. Let's give it to the towns to do it. And to me, as a climate council, we're going to have to address that. I know that the cross-sector subcommittee has identified, local and regional planning as a key issue, but it's something we've really got to think about. I think we've got, good resources to potentially get this right as a council. I know we're still designing that process and precisely the roadmap and blueprint of what we're going to do, but I hope we can give some time as a committee, as a subcommittee, and as a council to what all this looks like beyond the council to actually make this stuff work. And I was messaging back and forth with last night with about the research on local land use planning and the different. If you look at kind of comparative, land use planning strategies and processes in different states, I worry that a really diffuse planning process can potentially set up planning in Vermont to be very exclusive as opposed to inclusive. That at very small scales, you can wind up with virtual gated communities. And frankly, I think you could wind up with a virtual gated state. And it's some stuff that we really need to think about.
Yeah. How does this translate into the other processes beyond this that are crucial? Kelly, you there? I think we lost Kelly.
Sorry, you cut out and I didn't hear you say my name a minute ago.
Oh, sorry.
It might be my end. I don't know. There were a couple of takeaways that I had. The first was the importance of establishing trust and making sure that people know that it's safe to share their thoughts and views, and that they really will get the compensation. If we can provide compensation, that really is something that they're going to get for sharing their views. And then the other thing that came up a couple times was the importance of checking your findings. So if we have a listening session, saying, afterwards, okay, this is what I heard from you. Did I get that right? Did we hear you right? Or not just sort of taking what you thought you heard and rolling with it, and just coming back to the community and saying, let's confirm that we actually understood what you were talking about. And I thought that was really important and not something that I had previously been thinking about in this process.
Yeah. Great, and very aligned, Kelly, as well, with this idea of not having sort of an extractive mindset on this, where you're having a conversation. Am I hearing this right? Are we doing this together right? Okay. Other comments? I see, Iris, you put that chart in and I can't read it. Is that one of those charts that's like goes from the different gradations of participation? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So as usual, I've been trying to take some notes to make sure that we don't lose any of this. I mean, I can share what I've been taking down, and maybe this is helpful in you all correcting what I'm doing. And sorry if my internet's a little bit wonky right now. But these are the notes that I've been taking. And knowing there's likely ways to organize them a little better. But these are the big themes that I'm hearing you say, right? Taking the time you need to take to do this right. Making it accessible in many different ways, right? From the practical of childcare food compensating people's time and language barriers to the more sort of philosophical of, meet people where they are and go participate in events of others as well. And this opportunities for creating spaces, affinity spaces, where it's a conversation among a community. It's not so much of sort of in extracting ideas. Engage early, figuring out how to listen well, and the methodology you want to use for that. Trust is critical. Ensuring you heard well is important. Your curiosity is important. Providing education is important. Not being paternalistic is important. Virginia's point around there is an opportunity to raise civic engagement with people who aren't necessarily today experts in the way we would understand it, but have a lot to say about these issues. Refugee communities are important there. The way you go in and the space you open up is important. Keeping it broad allows you to understand the issues the way people are living it and work on the issues that are important to folks. And then Chris's point around this is all good for this process, and how do we want to imagine it projecting onto other processes like regional planning or local planning? Okay, so these are my notes. Again, it seems like a pretty good starting place. Just a real quick, is there any correction or improvement to that note? So folks want to shout out if we got something not quite right on this list?
Yeah, David, I just wanted to say, I don't, when I say meet people where they are, I don't mean that philosophically. I mean that like literally.
Literally. Yeah. Yeah.
I do. This is Sue, and I have some other thoughts, but I think in terms of what might not be clarified here was what Kaya really, the context of this is, we are, I think, wanting to be very intentional about including communities who have not been at this table before, and that our whole design has to start from there. And so I feel like it's almost the framing of what we're talking about, and I think that's part of what was an overriding point from last night, and I think it's the point of why we're here. And I think Jane earlier today shared, what I think the original RFP was doing, and we did get a chance to sort of broaden it, but it's what government is used to doing in moments like this, to come up with something and then go do a little PR pitch and get feedback and comments. And I think what we are talking about is something quite different, recognizing the historical reality and injustice of that process, and why we are where we are today with such inequity and inequality. And so somehow we are, I believe, tasked with designing a process that's entirely different and almost flipping that on its head. To start by education and engagement with folks who may or may not be thinking about these issues at all, but for whom we really value and want to include them. So anyway, I'm happy to think through strategies, but I guess it's just that framing is something so different than what we normally, what in my personal experience of 25 years in government are used to doing. Now, I will say that my community planning experience, and especially my experience in working with economically diverse populations, has taught me some new ideas. But most of what we're used to doing as a public body is this traditional, here's the plan, what do you think? And that's not what this is.
Great. Kaya?
There we go. Now I'm unmuted. So one of the things I was thinking about that I think might be powerful, I would really like to see this community engagement also really including multi-generational. So these folks are going to be leading these conversations. It's important to do a kind of multi-generational aspect there. It does need to be a sort of historical kind of accounting for a lot of communities. Usually when you look at something, if you step into a community and say, let's talk about what's happened around racism or anti-racism, you actually do need to do a little bit of a look back, because sometimes you're like, again, there isn't a problem. But then you'll have someone with the historical knowledge who's like, oh, remember when that happened 20 years ago? And so that can give people a place to start having a conversation, and will then also help enable, which is key, because this isn't just please tell us your stories. We want to create that sort of importance on visioning a different future. So what are your hopes and your dreams and your demands? Even without knowing or naming it as, I need my home to have green housing retrofits, even without knowing or naming that we still also need to look at, we need to further healthy community design, even without knowing or naming that your water quality, like that's what's going to be important, is so what would that look like? And I've seen some opportunities, these participatory budgeting processes, like what we're talking about with the green justice zones. I think about the work that Brian Chino was trying to do with the regenerative economy pieces, because again, that was trying to respond to the fact that communities were not engaged by RPCs on the energy plans. Not really. And so our bar for community engagement has been too low. So that's why we're trying to crack this open a little differently. So those are kind of my other, if I'm dreaming of something different, that will be part of how I dream of that.
Awesome. That's great. Kelly?
I think that's a really important point, Kaya. And I was thinking about how a lot of people put up with they just put up with a lot and don't realize that they're putting up with something that they maybe shouldn't have to put up with. And so I think that when you get that historical perspective and you get some examples, and in my own life, I see this when I talk to women business owners who've been at it for 30, 40 years, and I hear their stories and I go, oh my gosh, we've come a long way. But it also helps me reflect, like, oh, we're still dealing with a lot of sexism and a lot of bias. And I have an employee who's a person of color, and he was telling my husband about something that happened to him, and it was awful. And my husband said, I'm so sorry that happened to you. He goes, it's okay. He goes, no, it's not. It's not okay for people to treat you that way. But he sort of has this, this is my life, this is what I have to put up with kind of attitude. And I don't like to see that. And drawing people out in a conversation about historical things, and maybe you're still dealing with some of it now, might help people speak up about things that they're just sort of been putting up with quietly for a long time that really shouldn't be happening.
Yeah. Thanks, Kelly. Is that a new hand, Kai, or is that an old hand? Sorry.
That was an old hand, but I did throw something in the chat. I know I feel like
So-
I'm taking space. I keep taking space, but I guess we need to do that. So too. Also, when we're thinking about other ways to do assessments, I've loved some of the models that I've seen and I've used. We saw that down in Bennington County and other places to do participatory action research methods where the community members are doing that assessment work through the arts. So it becomes a different way of telling the same story without having to feel stuck on specific language to do that. So having youth taking pictures of their actual environment was super powerful to have 50 youth all over the county armed with cameras saying, this is what is unhealthy in my community. And that actually led to pretty rapid change in a number of different spaces. So that might be something else to look at ways as we're thinking about activating people in different regions to help get that assessment work done.
That's great. I'm just checking on the time because we made a change on the agenda. Maybe Nadia, you can give me a nod when we need to wrap this up if we want to get back on track, or if we have Beverly, if we solve the technology challenge we had. Nadia, do you know how we're doing here on that?
Yeah, Beverly is working on getting online shortly, so I will let you know when she's ready to rock. Thanks, David.
Nadia, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, Beverly, is that you?
Yes, I couldn't get on my computer because I don't have the password for the Wi-Fi where I'm at, but I could get on my phone so you can hear my voice.
Wonderful. And David, did you have any last thoughts before we head over the mic?
I think before we hand over to Beverly, the one thought I wanted to put out there is you will have at your disposal these consultants. Now they have a contract and TOR, terms of reference and everything, so they're a little bit tied. However, you can really influence them. And I think one of the areas where you'd want to influence them the most, in addition to sort of this big picture kind of conversation we're having, is specifically how to start, right? What's the first thing that should happen in the coming weeks or months? What needs to happen now-ish? And we may not have time to do that right now, but I feel like I want to plant that seed and know that they have things in their TORs, their terms of reference that talk about doing key stakeholder interviews and doing, and if Jane's on the line, she'll explain more. But they've got a couple specific things that they're doing. And so now what we need to do is get you all to really talk and to figure out how to sync up this vision you're putting out there with the specificity of the actions that they would start to do. So that's the next step.
Maybe
my instinct is, go ahead.
Sorry, David, just since you referenced that, I just wanted to offer that I'm happy to share both their proposal more widely, as well as the contract, especially so folks can sort of look at that ahead of next week to help frame their mindset for what was proposed from the group for outreach and engagement. So I'll share that for reference.
Thanks, Jane. Okay, so that's the next thing to do. Kaya, do you want to jump in on that? No.
I am studying not having my mouse over the mute button. So I'm so grateful. Thank you, Beverly, for joining us. So grateful to be able to have you here. So as we were saying, we were trying to frame this really as an opportunity for us to do active listening and to hear the perspectives that you and the wisdom that you may share from the work that you do and the roles that you play within the Native American Commission yourself as a Lakota, and letting us, kind of lean into learning more about this work and how it relates to the lives of Indigenous persons and as well here in Vermont. Thank you so, so much for sharing your time and your stories with us.
Not a problem. I'm just sorry that I got screwed up on the time. When you're traveling and you go through time changes, it just really messes with your mind. I was sitting here waiting for 4 o'clock so I could try to get on. I figured my daughter would be home and she'd give me the password, and I have no problem. I forgot there's 3 hours difference. But the reason I wanted to talk to the group was because I found myself wondering, what is my role on this committee? What can I possibly give? All I have heard is talk about economics. I've heard about making sure that the economy is not affected by the climate change and by all of the environmental injustices that are being done. And if we change them, we need to, consider the economy and how it's going to affect workers, how it's going to affect people in Vermont. And I understand all that. But, from a person of color's perspective, I know people who are driving old cars that put out all kinds of emissions because they don't have the funds to buy a new efficient car, a hybrid car. And they don't give it a thought. They're just concerned that they might be able to get from their house to the doctor's or to the store or wherever it is that they need to go. There are people who are concerned about having heat in their house. They're not even considering where the heat has come from or what fossil fuels are used so that they can stay warm. There are people who have not a clue as to what's going on in the environment aside from what they hear on the news, and how it impacts them is it just makes them poorer. It just makes them more invisible. And when we talk about a just transition, we have to consider those people because right now that's a huge population of Vermont. And most of those people are people of color, are people who are differently abled, are people who are just downright old. And to transition, in a just way, we have to hear their voices. We have to know what they're thinking. And we have to think about how is this just transition going to affect them? And what provisions are going to be made for them? And it takes money. It takes a lot of money. And that's what I hear people being concerned about. But I hear them being concerned that the people who already have what they need, who aren't worried about their car breaking down, who aren't worried about not being able to get to the doctors, that's their economy. How is that going to affect their work? How is that going to affect their ability to get around? And when I hear that, I wonder, why is it that I'm sitting in this committee feeling invisible? Feeling like, even when I'm listening, there's at no point can I jump in and make a comment, because in my culture, you don't interrupt someone who's talking. And that's another thing. We have to look at the different cultures we have here in Vermont. Not everybody thinks, talks, or even comes to a meeting in the same way. And so I wanted to put that out there because I want to be an effective part of this committee. And I don't speak for the entire Native American Commission, but I do speak as a Native American woman who has lived here in Vermont for 16 years and who, in all probability, is going to die here. I live off-grid. I live with solar power. But I did not know that living that rural, that when the sun doesn't shine and I don't get the power that we need, we have to have a diesel-powered generator to back up. And it makes me sick to my stomach every time I hear that generator go on, because I know what's happening to our environment every time we use it. But I'm fortunate. I'm fortunate because through my activism, through all of the communities that I've lived in all my life, I understand those things. But a lot of my peers don't. A lot of my peers are too busy trying to put food on the table, take care of their families, and just hope and pray that they don't get evicted from their house because they can't pay the rent. So when we talk about, our BIPOC people in this community, that's what we're talking about. And I just have not seen where we fit in this just transition. Thank you for listening to me. I don't mean to sound like a rant, but it's what's been on my mind.
Thank you for speaking your truth on that, Beverly.
Thank you, Beverly. What are some of the reactions we have from our members of the subcommittee on this issue, or perhaps, just members of the subcommittee?
Well, I would like to share, Beverly, this is Sue, and I'm so grateful to you for being a part of this conversation, and especially for sharing those feelings. And, I'm feeling sad that you're feeling that there isn't the space. So we're trying to create better space for communication and engagement. But what I want to say in terms of what I believe that you bring to this group is a great deal of wisdom and life experience. But even more importantly, a connection to the very people that you're speaking of that I think we're trying to put in the front of our work instead of in the back. And as a white woman of privilege, I don't often know the many ways in which the actions that I and others take do not allow for your space that you're looking for. I did want to respond about just two things. Well, one, the car. And I'm just going to mention that we do have this program to help lower income people get hybrid, higher fuel efficiency cars. And it's because of the very folks that you're talking about, and us recognizing that, an incentive for electric vehicles was never going to be beneficial to lower income people. And so when you start saying, well, what could we do for lower income people that would help them get transportation and lower carbon emissions, we came up with another strategy. So I just hope that we create the space for you to share ideas that can address, I think we can, if we put our heads together and learn, both reduce greenhouse gases and improve the lives of the most vulnerable. But it takes the wisdom that you and others have to help us.
Beverly, something you said that really resonated with me, this is Nadia, is that you've seen individuals when they talk about environmental policy, their reaction is it just makes them poorer. And it's really, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because it is exactly that issue that we're trying to figure out here. How can we create principles and policies and a framework for protecting the environment that doesn't pick winners and losers? And I was listening to a webinar recently that talked about how good governance is for the people, by the people. And one thing COVID has elucidated, that has not created, but has again just shown a light on, is that that's not the way governance works. And there has to be work like what we're doing on this committee to really make sure that all those important voices are heard and brought to this table, and that we as agents and representatives of those voices continue to build the momentum and take those voices to the other subcommittees. And I'm so immensely grateful for you to come forward and to address this important issue so that we can make sure that our subconscious bias, if you will, is checked at the door, and we're making sure that all these important voices are heard. Anything else the members would like to add? Members of the public as well? Kaya, did you raise your hand?
I did. I'm so grateful again that you were willing to share this space with us and to speak so clearly about what we need to do. How we can change these processes. I know you know this in your bones, that our bureaucratic ways of managing things, even down to, so we had to have a whole conversation around Robert's rules, the ways that we think about what leadership is, right? The ways that we even think about, leadership. For many, many cultures, leadership does not have a kind of white male patriarchal kind of component to the way that that leadership shows. And so it is not always, I have to be in front, and that is how I share my power, and that is how I share our collective liberation. It's very often different. And so as we are thinking through, so even with these electric vehicles, even with these hybrid vehicle programs, there's still going to have to be some really hard conversations, because while those initiatives were there, were we a part of those conversations? Were we a part of like determining what that structure might look like? Because in some communities, it might be a shared vehicle instead of everyone having an individual vehicle. And some communities, it might be, can we create an enterprise model, co-op model for people to provide courier services for other individuals? Those are the things when we're saying, what are the dreams of our people? What are the dreams of these impacted communities? They probably look different than how we are creating them in policy versus how we are thinking about them in community.
Well, if I might add to that, Kaya, we also need to think about those people who live rurally. I live out in the middle of nowhere. We don't have public transportation there. At one point, I had broken my hip, and the senior group that meets in our town every month said, "Oh, we'll send a van up to pick you up so you can join us." They came once, and the next time they said, "Oh, our driver is too scared to drive up the hill. It was scaring some of the other riders, so he won't come pick you up anymore." So, there are people who, fortunately, I feel that I'm able to get off that mountain now, but there are people who live rurally. And I hate to say it, but electric car will not help those people if they can barely pay the electric bill for their house, because you have to plug those in to keep them running. And it's great to have stations in town, but that means if we're going to even have a shared electric car, we have to have someplace in these towns where they can be recharged. So when I speak, I think about, I speak about those people who aren't at the table right now, who aren't comfortable telling their stories and talking about how difficult it is for them. Our environment is, for me, it's at the top of my list of things that need to be addressed. And I do everything I possibly can to try to educate other people about the environment in ways that they can help. But if we're talking about policy for our whole state, we have to consider everybody in our state, even those people who live up dirt roads like I do and can't get to town sometimes. So those are the kinds of things that, that I've been thinking about that I've been stewing about, I guess. But thank you for giving me the opportunity to share them, to share those thoughts.
Thank you, Beverly. I think we have a hand raised from Maddie and then Liz.
Yes, hi. Thanks for having me. This is my second meeting that I've attended so far. Thank you, Beverly, for sharing. And I really want to commend this group, just from these two meetings, how great you all are at taking into account all populations. And I think it's really great, the potential that you all have to make a change in regard to climate change and in people's lives in a very real way. I wanted to add or riff off of something that Beverly was saying in regard to civic engagement, is that something I've thought about a lot is there's a lot more people that live paycheck to paycheck than I was previously aware of. And I think in this presidential race especially, there's been a lot more talk about, giving people money or just making sure that they have that security in general to get a spare tire fixed or, anything like that, just that security. And I imagine it's really hard for people in a compromised situation to see into the future in regard to climate change, especially because although we can see and understand some effects that we have now, changing weather, we don't get long summer or long winters in Vermont anymore. It's still hard for folks to see the effects that might happen in 10 or 15 years if we don't make change now. And making sure that that communication is accessible and understandable to folks that are just not thinking in a long-term way because they're so focused on paying for that spare tire or, paying for their electricity bill, that very front-minded finance that a lot of folks in our communities have. It's hard to think long-term in terms of what would happen to my house if I don't take care of this one situation or I don't change the way that my power comes into my home, those long-term effects, I think. So in terms of communicating language barriers, lots of folks speak different languages, but also in terms of making sure that we don't speak in a jargony way or things that other folks might not understand or not have the confidence to speak up and say, hey, I don't understand what you meant when you said this phrase. Just making sure that that communication is really understandable and accessible to folks that may not be thinking about things like this on an everyday basis. Thanks for letting me share. And yeah, you all are doing great.
Thank you, Liz.
Hi, yeah, I'll be really quick. I just wanted to say thank you to Beverly for sharing. And as you were, speaking your share, I just was thinking about how we are defining our success as this group and as a climate council, as a whole, and how we're defining our standard for public engagement and where we're setting our bar. Because before this meeting, I thought we were, we're doing a good job, and I think we are, and I think we'll get there. But then Beverly shared that she doesn't know what her place is in this group, and just that made me think okay, maybe we're not doing as good of a job as we think we are, and just making sure we're avoiding an echo chamber of all of us talking to each other about what we think it is, and just really putting emphasis on making sure we're inviting outside perspectives to check us and check our process and our standard. And I just thought it was important to share.
Absolutely. Thank you, Liz. Chris, you have your hand raised.
Beverly, thanks so much for sharing your truth with us and your perspective. The Just Transition Subcommittee, to me, a fundamental question that we've got to get at is, I think most of the marginalized communities and people, and the people who don't have the same privilege as you know, I mean, I'm one of the most privileged creatures to walk the planet. You know, your carbon footprint is probably much smaller, and people in marginalized communities, their carbon footprints are probably much smaller than you know the privileged folk who generally have been driving the conversations around these things. I just think it's, you know, for example, we went straight to the conversation about the hybrid car. Well, you know, relative to relative to the overall carbon footprint, maybe, you know, the hybrid car is not for some of the communities that we're looking at, and you know, people in their households' carbon footprint. That's not the problem. It's people who are living with much larger carbon footprints, who are where, you know, since a big part of our task is to reduce carbon emissions in the state, that's probably not the problem. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be working to get everybody a more fuel efficient car and hybrids and other things like that. But, you know, trying to say, no matter what, you know, and I don't think that's where we're going, but, you know, certainly I can see where folk would feel like, well, the Climate Council is going to say we should all have new hybrid cars, and how on earth am I going to afford that? The Climate Council is going to say we should all have heat pump hot water heaters. Well, how am I going to afford that? The Climate Council is going to say I should have a heat pump dryer, or figure out how otherwise to dry my clothes. You know, just all these things, these technologies that exist that cost money to reduce carbon. And you know, that to me, that's a fundamental piece that we need to address is, you know, really where are the priorities, and really own the truth of that. You know, and that really is going to get into incomes and how people live, and how we live in totality, right? And you know, that's always the hard thing. You know, I mean, on most environmental issues, but particularly on climate, that's going to be a hard truth that we're going to have to get at. So, but I really, really appreciate your. I imagine, since you said you communicate differently, I imagine that was not easy to share, and really, really appreciate your strength and willingness to do that.
Thank you.
Before we pass the mic to Kelly, does anyone have any reactions thus far? Beverly, did you want to react to any of the comments that you've heard, or anyone else?
No, not at this time. I don't need to say anything. I'm sure as I think about it, I might have something to say at the next meeting. Because I'm not going to stay invisible on this committee anymore. So thank you.
Great. Kelly?
Thank you so much, Beverly. And please, I hope you don't stay invisible. I've been wanting to hear from you, and I really, really appreciate you sharing. A couple of things Chris said reminded me of something that came up at the thing last night, that a lot of people in rural and impoverished communities may have a small carbon footprint, but they're probably more at risk for the negative impacts of climate change. And I think there's been a lot of focus in the Climate Council as a whole and in other subcommittees on, okay, we have to reduce our emissions. This is our goal. We have to follow this, but we also are charged with protecting communities from the negative impacts of climate change. And I'm not sure. I think that we can be thinking, our committee can be thinking about, you know, when we talk to rural resilience, for example, that subcommittee be thinking about the marginalized communities who are most at risk for, you know, flooding and other sorts of impacts. So maybe we don't need to say you need an electric car. Maybe we need to say, how can we help protect you if there's a severe weather event? How can we help make sure that these communities are safe and secure and not? There was the talk of, you know, people being on a boil water. That, you know, the trailer park had to boil water or buy bottled water, whereas the more affluent communities were immediately switched over to city water. Just, you know, those sorts of things, they're going to happen more and more with severe weather events and things like that. And I'm not sure that there's a big focus that's been put on that side of this project. And also, I'm not sure that the folks who are in charge of focusing on that are necessarily as aware front of their mind about some of these issues that we've been talking about in our committee. So I just wanted to elevate that because that came up last night and ties in a little bit with what Chris was saying.
Sarah, did you have something to add?
Yeah, thanks. And thank you, Beverly, so much for jumping in and sharing your experience and your experience in this group to date. I think that's valuable for us to hear. And I'm looking forward to you returning and continuing to bring your voice to this work. I was thinking about something Kelly was saying that's a very specific example that I'll share from the work that I do. And that is this conversation around low-income Vermonters and climate and energy. And I have to tell you, it must come up once, if not 3 or 4 times a year, that we should use the funding for fuel assistance to support weatherization. And that once somebody's home is weatherized, somehow we're not going to need to be able to provide fuel assistance. And people just miss the total disconnect there, is that you can weatherize a home, but that doesn't necessarily change someone's economic security, right? It makes it more affordable to live there, but it doesn't necessarily negate the fact that they still may have energy security issues that require ongoing fuel assistance. So I think the power of this group is to be able to, that's a very specific example, and others may not agree with me, but I feel like that's the kind of lens that we can bring to this work to make sure that the policy decisions that come out of this plan aren't, for instance, saying, let's use LIHEAP money for weatherization because we won't need fuel assistance anymore. You know, it's those kind of policies that I think are just so important for us to shine a light on. And Beverly, when you were talking about this, it just rings so true to me in terms of the experience of people with low incomes and where people are at. And I think that's really important. So thanks.
I want to make sure to create space for. Oh, go ahead, Beverly. Sorry.
Yeah, and with that, I just would like to add one more thing. You know, when we're talking about, you know, decreasing the effects of climate change on people who are marginalized, I think that most of the policies that have been put in place in the past have been put in place by white people. And so people of color haven't been at the table to help with those decisions. And you know, now we have an opportunity where we have some people of color, maybe tokenized people of color, but they're there. And we need to start thinking about the racism in the state. Because someone who is in, you know, in an environment where they feel that they're the minority and they have a history of being treated poorly, might not want to speak up, might not even want to go and ask for energy assistance, might not even want somebody to come into their house and see the way that they have to live.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
I mean, there's so many pieces to it, And I think that, you know, as a committee, we need to check ourselves. We need to look, you know, what are our biases? And what are the things that we don't think about because of those biases? I think what we focus on says more about where we're coming from than we realize. It's those unspoken things that we don't voice that sometimes get shoved under the rug, and you know, people look at, you know, someone says, well, you're being racist. people automatically think, oh, that means they're saying I'm a bad person. No, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It means that you don't realize the things that you do and how they impact others. And policymakers have been doing that for eons. And, and I fully agree that, a government for the people and by the people were just words that were written on a piece of paper a long time ago. And I've yet to see that happen. So I'll shut up now.
No, I want to say thank you. Sort of from my church background, I want to say amen, but that might not be the right word. Thanks.
I want to create a space too for individuals who have not had the opportunity to say something. And Sue, I saw your hand raised. I'm not sure if you'd want to proceed. Well, I'll say at least from my experience, that I love this discussion. It has really illuminated some opportunities for us as a subcommittee. I'm sure it has illuminated opportunities for us as individuals and what we bring to the table, the subconscious bias that we bring, perhaps a conscious bias that we bring that we're all working through. And Beverly, I think you've created a momentum that is integral and important to this work. And so thank you for providing your insights. Anything else before we move on? So we have an opportunity for public comment and some final reflections. Are there members of the public who would like to provide some comments or questions? And so any final reflections before we adjourn? I think a big final reflection is thank you to everyone. Oh, Iris, please. See you, Iris.
Sorry. First of all, thank you so much, Beverly. That was amazing. And just that's all. I don't want to take any more time saying how amazing that was, just because I'd rather just have people reflect on what you've said. I just wanted to note that I sat in on the agriculture and ecosystems subcommittee meeting last week, and I just wanted to I'll do that this week too. Note that part of what they were saying is that they are moving into working groups and starting to break up into smaller groups to get this work done, and that they're looking for guidance from us on what guidelines they should have in those smaller working groups, and what filter they should run their policies through. And I think that if we don't create that soon, they're going to end up doing that work without the framework that we provide them, and then it'll be more retroactive in a way that I think is not what we would want for this process. So that's all. Sorry.
Thank you. And I think you bring up a great point that we need to discuss, add this to the agenda perhaps for next meeting, space for what you're hearing on other subcommittees as representatives of Just Transitions, but also starting that conversation on the guidelines and the frameworks that we want to provide to those other subcommittees. Sue, do you have any final words?
It isn't final words. It's really following on Iris's point. I'm wondering if there's any interest in having a work group of this group who really want to dig in on those principles, because I think much of our next meeting is probably going to be more on the engagement. But if there's people who want to think about and dig in on a lot of what we learned last night, I think we have a lot of material there that we might discuss. So that would be a great way to proceed. I have a feeling we're going to need to depend, like the other groups, on work groups. So that was my thinking on process.
I would encourage you all, Jane, just to consider I can't remember if we've done this, and forgive me at this point, with Sue and Sarah. before Nadia and Kaya were brought into the co-chair role, outside of a meeting or within this meeting, where we started to think about sort of the buckets of work for Just Transitions and started to think about task leads, and that way there could be some in-between meeting momentum on the sort of core work of the group, and therefore brought back to the group for discussion. But if that hasn't happened at the group level yet, that would be really important to think about. And I would just encourage, rather than sort of self-identifying with the principles right away, present all of, I feel like there were 3 or 4 sort of clear areas of work for this group. And that way folks could sort of figure out where they want to spend energy outside of the meetings working.
Great, thank you. Sarah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, our co-chairs meet on Friday, and maybe we can take up this piece around how we move forward that conversation as sort of for that work as a key next.
Great, thank you. I think that with that we can adjourn our meeting. Thank you for all the lovely insights, everyone. It's a fantastic momentum meeting here.
Yeah. Have a nice night.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Beverly.
Everybody.
Bye.